Despite how good the transmissions are on modern mountain bikes, they're never going to work well if they're well set up, they're clean, they're lubricated, and more importantly, that they have clean and smooth inner and outer gear cables on them. So in today's video, we're going to show you how to replace them on my bike, which has a combination of external cable routing and a bit of internal. So I'm going to give you some tips to suit both styles of bike. Now you're going to need a selection of tools for this job. It will differ slightly depending on the type of bike you have. For my bike with a Shimano derailleur, I'll need a 4mm Allen key for the derailleur on the back for that pinch bolt. You need some quality cable cutters, some needle nose pliers might be helpful for you as well. You'll obviously need a fresh, good quality inner cable and some outer cable, along with the ferrules and cable end caps. Thin lubricant is also highly recommended. Now let's talk a little bit about the style of cable routing on mountain bikes. There's a few different styles of internal and external out there. So this is just to help you understand what you may have on your bike. Now the first option is traditional external routing. So you'll have a number of stops on the frame, typically steel frames, maybe alloy frames, hardtail frames, things like that. And you'll have a selection of cable stops on the frame and you'll bridge those with sections of outer cable. They can only really be the length to bridge them, so it's fairly easy to trim the outer down to suit. The only real drawbacks of this kind of system is it can look visually noisy, so certain frame designs it just won't look as clean. And also the inner cable moving around on the outside can pull moisture back into those sections of outer housing. So it's not ideal if you ride in the wetter climates, but still it's a very easy system to work with. The other external option is the entire route, all the way from shifter to derailleur. Now I've had this on various old bikes. My old Nuke-proof Mega had this and had an entire length of outer housing. Now this is brilliant because of the fact that you only need to have one length of housing. There's less chance of moisture getting in there. However, when the moisture does get in to the long lengths of outer housing, you get loads of friction. So it's really important to keep these clean. Now I found in the past with these style systems, you can get away with just changing the inner cable and flushing out the housing with some thin lubricant. So it might be worth considering that before spending the money on a full setup, but that's just another option for you. And then it comes to internal, and there's different styles within this. So when internal style cable routing came out, it tended to literally be an opening at the head tube, so we'll call this a cable port, and another one at the other end of the frame, and literally nothing in between. So threading the hoses and the cables and stuff through the frame became an absolute nightmare. So to do this, you might need a very specialist tool. Park make one called an internal cable routing kit. I didn't list that in tools because it is a specialist one. You'll only need this for certain jobs here. Now the cool thing about this is it has a selection of different inner cables and they each have different fittings on there for pulling through different style outer housing, and you have a really powerful magnet. Now the theory is you would feed it into the frame and you would chase it with the magnet from the outside of the frame all the way through to that open port, whether it's at the bottom of the bottom bracket shell or at the end of the frame. And you could use that cable once it's through, you attach it to some outer housing and pull it back through the frame. So a really good system if you have one of the older style frames with no internal channels or anything like that. Now you also get frames that have partial systems. So my Canyon Lux, for example, the chainstays on the bike, it has tubing already built into there, but it's quite an acute angle, so you can only get the housing in from the back end of the frame towards the front. So you might need to ask some tips from your local bike shop on your particular frame if you're not sure, because they do vary slightly. Then you get some frames that have full internal channels. So Santa Cruz and some other brands out there, for example, have full internal channels where you literally feed the outer housing in at the head tube and it pops out the other end of the frame. Now you're starting to see that on newer frames, and it's a brilliant system. And if you have one of those, you're in luck because it's dead easy to replace them. The frame I'm working on has kind of like the older system at the front end, so it's open. You have cable entry ports at the front of the head tube there, and under the bottom bracket shell you have a bigger opening. So I'm going to be using the Park tool to thread the system through there, and then it's external on a chainstay. So the same system applies there to external cable routing. And there is one other really cool tool I just want to reference here. It's dead cheap and free in some cases. And it comes with the RockShox Reverb seat post. So if your bike has one on it, or you've bought one of those posts aftermarket, if you look in a packet with a manual and the sticker and all the stuff that comes with it, there's a little red tool in there. Now essentially this is a threaded tool on both sides and you use it to join outer housing together. So the idea is you would use your old dropper post cable that's running through the frame to pull that fresh reverb one through just by threading them together. You can buy that tool for £2 or £3 online, dirt cheap. I definitely recommend get one because at some point it will come in handy for you. I've got a bit of a combo of tools here, so we'll see what we need to use in this video. Before we get started, as with any maintenance job, it's all about preparation first. So make sure you've got all the tools that you need for the job. Make sure you've had a quick look at your frame first and you understand the routing on your frame, especially if it's internal. If you're unsure, get online, ask someone about it, ask about your particular model, ring up your bike shop, wherever you bought the bike from, just to double check in case you're going to need one of those specialist tools. It's worth it because if you run into problems, it can be a bit of a headache. So I'm going to start this by shifting my bike into the highest gear. So that is the smallest gear at the back. The reason for that is it has the least amount of cable tension. So you don't want any tension on the system when you're undoing that pinch bolt on the derailleur. Next step obviously is to undo that pinch bolt. It's a 4mm in my case, but it might be a 5 on yours. It might be a different type of derailleur altogether. And then it's a case of making sure you get the little crimped on end cap off the cable. You might need to cut this with cable cutters and then pretty much pull the cable out. To do this and make it easier, I like to go up to the handlebar area there and just pull the housing away from the shifter, exposing the inner cable, and then you can pull it out all the way from there. Step 2 is to remove the inner cable from the shifter itself. And now this one's a Shimano shifter, so it has just a little plug on there. Yours might be a plug that you can pull out, just a rubber one, or it might, like this one, need a screwdriver to remove it. They do differ slightly on different shifters. Some SRAM shifters, you actually have to remove the top of the shifter. It does look a bit more self-explanatory when you see it than the way I've just described it, but it's a fairly simple process. Once the little plug has been removed, you're free to just push the cable straight out. Now, just before you go to the next step, make sure that shifter is in the smallest gear or the highest gear, and you don't actuate that because it will make it harder or impossible to get the cable back in again at the end of the video. If you've been riding in loads of foul weather, at this stage it's a good idea just to spray some water displacer into your shifter there. Obviously, when you're spraying anything near your bike, make sure it can't go near your braking surfaces, your brake rotors or your brake pads. And the final bit of prep on the shifter to do is just to wind the barrel adjuster back in. Now what I'd like to do is wind it all the way back in and then out again, just a couple of clicks, just to give me margin of error. That means if I end up pulling the cable a little bit tight at the other end, when I start putting the bike back together again, I can just undo it again at the shifter without having to continuously make alterations at the derailleur. And now it's time to remove the outer housing from the bike. Now before you go pulling this out, just take into account which method you're going to be using. If you've got external cable routing, speaks for itself at this point. It's dead easy. You literally just remove the sections, offer them up to your new section and trim them down and replace them. If you're using a full length, same thing, offer it up to a new section. But if you're using internal, you've got to know what system you've got. You don't want to go pulling the system all the way through and then find you haven't got the tool in order to get it out again. Now in my case, I have got the park tool, so I'm going to use that to actually get the outer housing through the frame and enable myself to pull a fresh set back through again. And also just take into account when you do this, whether you need to do it from the head tube end down towards the bottom bracket or vice versa. It will differ slightly on different models of bike. Now an important note to make about the length of your outer housing, observe before you remove it from your bike if yours is too short or too long. Now I'm going to just show you something with mine to tell you, to demonstrate the fact it's the optimum length. So I've just offered up my outer housing back to the shifter. Now if your bars can turn past the top tube without fouling on them, you want to allow for them to turn 180 degrees if possible to match the rest of your hosing and cables on there without pulling out the shifter end. And the same, just check it in both directions. This will differ depending on which side you run your brakes on and which way you have your cables porting into the frame there. So this is as short as it can possibly be, which is the ideal, but it allows that handlebar to spin around in the event of a crash or by accident if it falls on the floor and nothing's going to get damaged. So just take that into account when you're trimming your new one down. I'm going to trim mine down by actually pulling my whole outer housing out because I'm going to leave the part tool inside the frame. Then I can neatly cut my new housing to match this old one. However, if you're unsure about this, another method to do would be to put the fresh housing into the frame, offer it up at both ends, and then obviously move things around. Something you might want to take into account if your bike has external cable routing or any unusual routing where the cable moves around strange parts of the bike is how much your rear suspension moves. If your suspension moves quite a lot and the housing moves with it, there's a good chance if you run it too short, you're going to mess up your gears. So also just take that into account. Okay, so I have released the inner cable from the bike, and as you've just seen, I've just trimmed the chainstay cable ties on the other side of the bike. I've flipped it around now so you can see it, and I've released the outer housing from the rear. So as I said before, it had external on the rear of the bike and internal on the front. So the routing of the cable comes out from the shifter on the right-hand side of the bike. It goes in at the head tube on the left-hand side, down the down tube and out at the bottom here, where there's a little plate that actually clamps the cables in place to stop them rattling. Now that has a 3mm bolt on there holding it in place. Before you remove it, and the same will apply on your bike, whatever system you have, just check the cable orientation. So I've got a brake hose routed down the left-hand chainstay, and it overlaps and goes in on the right-hand side of the bike, crosses over. So just have to make sure they stay in the right place for everything to work as it should do. Now at this stage, you're left with a few different options on this particular bike, how you can do things. You could rip that out completely and you could hit and hope with a fresh bit of outer housing. And to be fair, I have done that before and it is possible, but it can be extremely infuriating trying to line it up perfectly and get it out. And quite often when you poke it through, you can see it in the shell there, thanks to the big hole basically in the bottom of the frame, but you need to fish it out with something. So it is possible, but I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you absolutely have to. So you're left with two options: an internal cable routing kit of some kind, or the little barb tool from RockShox. So I could just join the old outer housing with some fresh outer housing with that barb tool. You literally just thread it into one, into the other, then use the outer housing, put it through the frame and it pulls the new one in place. And that's a great way of doing it. But in this case, because I want to show you a few things with the outer housing when I trim it down, I'll use the park version. So this again has a threaded section on one end and use it to pull through the frame, and then this will stay inside the frame. And when I'm ready, I'll use it to pull the fresh section back through again. Like I said, there's different options for different things. And you may find that you need to get a kit like this if you have multiple bikes, or you might fluke it and not need one at all. Okay, so we have the outer housing, the old one that is, and the fresh stuff. So this is primed to get it the exact length. And bear in mind that I had mine the perfect length on my bike. This might not be the right step for you, but it does mean I can show you something else as well. So let's just offer this up and trim it down. Now, when you're trimming down outer housing, it's less important than inner, to be honest, but you should only ever use proper cable cutters and don't use them for anything else other than trimming inner and outers, because of the fact when they go blunt, you really start messing up those inner cables and they'll fray. So if you get yourself a good set of cable cutters, no matter what the brand, if you only use them for that, they should stay sharp for a long time. There we go. So I'm going to make my cut. Now, when you trim them down, you naturally end up crimping the end slightly. So there is a tool on the end of the cable cutters for correcting this and just making sure it's round again rather than ovalized. But sometimes you might find when you look closely, the little sheath on the inside is also crimped. You want to try and open that up again. So a good way of doing that is with a pick and literally just open it up. And that means when you put the ferrules on the end caps there, you can guarantee that the inner cable will just slide in nicely. So check that at both ends of the outer housing. Good bit of cable prep there. Now time to just screw that internal cable routing tool back into the fresh outer housing. Make sure it goes in all the way. So you want to try and pull it as much as possible to get it going and then feed it through. Now sometimes you might find some resistance on the inside of the frame. That can be from bottle bosses, it can be from a number of parts of the way the frame is manufactured. So just be careful. But as you can see, this one has come out perfectly and it's going back over just as the routing was to start with. Now, instead of just putting the cable hatch back on, I'm actually just going to make sure I've got the outer housing clamped down in place on the chainstay, because it can only be a certain length at this end, whereas the movement can occur at the front of the bike. So I'm going to get that clamped on the other side, then flip the bike back around in the stand so I can secure this. Okay, so ferrule on and then feed it into the derailleur. Now I'm actually going to join the cable ties here at this stage, but I'm only going to do them loose, not completely tight. I'll do that at the end along with trimming them down. This is just to make sure the cable is all in the correct place and it's not going to catch anywhere. So I'm just going to pull that one a little tighter than the others just to keep it in place. Now I'm going to flip around to the other side and just close the port cover. Okay, with the outer cable trimmed down and successfully back in the bike, it's time to sort of address the system and prepare it for that new inner cable. Now at this stage, I always like to flush a little bit of lubricant through the outer housing. It's up to you how you do this. You could use a spray lube. Again, if you use spray, just be cautious of where that spray can go near your brake rotors and stuff like that. I quite like to put a few drops of wet chain lube in the end at the head tube end. And I find when you push the inner cable through the outer housing, goes quite a way really, and it's just enough to keep out the moisture. Now just before you put the inner cable back through the shifter, just confirm that it's in the lowest gear, because quite often it's the only way that you're going to be able to get the inner cable through the shifter. And then by using line of sight, if you line yourself up with the hole, you should be able to see daylight through it, and it'll just help you feed it straight through. Give it a little tug just to make sure it's sat in place neatly, and then replace the little cap just on the outside there. Obviously you only need to nip it up, it's just a cap, it hasn't got any sort of torque settings or anything crazy on it. Now just sense check before we put things back together at this point that you've done things in the correct order, and if everything is looking okay, now it's time to feed the inner cable through the outer all the way down to the rear derailleur. Before you tension that inner cable, just double check you've got the routing right at the derailleur itself. It can be confusing on certain models of derailleur, so just double check that it's pulling in the correct place and it's in the little stops as it should be. Check the outer housing is nicely seated at the shifter end and again at the derailleur end before you tension that cable. Now the thing with tensioning the gear inner cables is you only ever pull them taut. You don't pull it tight because it really doesn't take much pull to actuate the derailleur. So if you're pulling it and it's moving the derailleur, you're pulling it too hard. And thankfully, as I told you at the beginning of the video, this is the reason I like to just leave a little bit of a couple of turns on the shifter there. It just gives you room for error in case you have pulled it a tiny bit too tight, because you can unwind it again at the shifter end. If your gears were working correctly before this video, you won't need to do this process. It's dead easy, but you will just need to adjust the cable tension. So to adjust the cable tension, what you're looking for is one gear lever click corresponding to one gear shifted. And you'll only need to do this for the first 3 or 4 gears at the bottom. If your derailleur is set up properly with the limits done, this will work all the way up your block and all the way back down again. So just double check that and make sure your gears are working smoothly, and everything should be absolutely fine. Now you might find after a few rides that the cable has stretched. Now let me just break down a barrier of what that actually means. The inner cable is not stretching. All it really means is the ferrules will be squashing over the outer cable and they'll be settling into the stops, both at the shifter end and at the derailleur end. And all that means is there might be like 0.5 millimetre or something of movement in the whole system, so it gives a bit of slack. And that's what the barrel adjuster is for on the lever, just to take that slack back out again. It isn't actually the cable physically stretching as such. Now, if you're unsure about your indexing, there will be another video underneath this one detailing everything you need to know to index your gears and get the stops set up correctly. That's your limit screws, the high, the low, and the B tension, also known as the B screw. But other than that, it's a pretty simple process, and hopefully this video has helped you out. Don't forget, have a sense check over the bike afterwards, replace any cable ties as needed with the routing, make sure they're trimmed down nice and flush, there's no sharp edges that can accidentally catch yourself when you're maintaining your bike, and then go and enjoy it. Hopefully this video has been useful for you, and we'll see you in the next one. Ta-ra.